Last class, we learned about some people that did some pretty incredible things. But did you ever stop to wonder, how do we know what we know about history? Some of these people that we're studying died over 100 years ago. So, how do we know so much about the things they did during their lives? Well, in history, we look at many different sources of information. For example, what if you wanted to learn about Martin Luther King Jr.? Martin Luther King Jr. died almost 50 years ago, so you couldn't actually see him or talk to him. You'd have to find other sources of information that could teach you about him. You could check out books from the library that are about him, or you could even look at letters that he wrote to his friends, or speeches that he gave while he was still alive. All of those are important sources of information that you could use to learn about him, even though it happened in the past. Part 1 of your worksheet introduces you to some new sources of information that maybe you haven't heard of before that you're going to learn about today. You're going to use the next 4 definitions to fill in the definitions for Part 1 of your worksheet. The first source of information we're going to talk about is a biography. A biography can teach you a lot about the way things were in the past. A biography is the story of a person's life. So again, if we wanted to study Martin Luther King Jr., a good place to start is by reading his biography. These are books written about his life. Usually they're labeled biography. This one says biography up in this corner. This one says biography in that corner. All it means is that it's the story of his life. Copy down the definition of biography onto your worksheet. Now, sometimes we're really lucky because we get to read a biography written by the person that we're studying. This is called an autobiography. That's the story of a person's life written by that person. So earlier we studied Malcolm X. Some of what we know about Malcolm X comes from an autobiography that he wrote. That's the story of his life written by him. What a great source of information. The story of a person's life written by that person. Another source of information we have is an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia is a book of articles. Sometimes it's many different books because there's so many articles they can't fit in one book. This book is an encyclopedia of Native American tribes. That means it's a book of articles about Native American tribes. One of the most famous encyclopedias that people use nowadays is actually on the internet. It's online. It's called Wikipedia. Wikipedia is a free encyclopedia, and people can use it to look up articles that will teach them about different topics. So I can look up an article about the history of Louisiana, and it will give me a lot of great information about the history of Louisiana. The next source of information that we're going to talk about, the last definition you need to fill on your worksheet, is an almanac. An almanac is a book of facts. They usually come out every year, and they'll have lots of facts about that year. What was the population that year? How much rain fell that year? What was the weather like that year? Almanacs are just big books of facts. This is a sports almanac. It's going to have facts about different sports, who won which games, what the statistics of different players were, and all types of facts like that related to sports. So now we know a few different sources of information that we can use to learn about the past. We need to learn about the 2 main types of sources that we can look at, and those are primary and secondary sources. Remember when we talked about the sources that we can use to study Martin Luther King Jr.? Well, these are actually 2 different types of sources. These are books written about him, and these are materials written by him himself. So these were written by other people after he died. These are documents that Martin Luther King actually wrote himself, and they were actually there while he was alive. The first type of source is this second source, primary sources. Primary sources are written during the time that you are studying. So if I'm studying Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, primary sources are going to be those sources that were written while he was still alive. Letters that he wrote or people wrote to him, diaries of his friends or even himself, autobiographies of people that met him, or speeches that he gave while he was still alive. These are all primary sources because they were there at the time that we're studying. Copy down the definition of primary sources and the examples into the first two boxes on your worksheet for part 2. Now, under that, you see there's another type of source called a secondary source. Those are going to be our sources over here. Remember, the letters and the speeches were written by him while he was still alive. After that, people wrote books about him to help other people understand what his life was like. Those are going to be called secondary sources. Those came second. Those were written after his lifetime, written after the event that we're looking at. So, people will take primary sources like letters and diaries, and then they'll put the information together to create secondary sources like encyclopedias, textbooks, brain pop videos, and magazine articles. All of those were made after Martin Luther King already died. They're not primary sources, they're secondary sources. They're written after his lifetime. Let's look at a few examples, and maybe this will become a little clearer. Remember when we talked about autobiographies? That's a story of a person's life written by that person. Now, since the person that we're studying wrote their own biography, that's going to be a primary source. It was written by somebody who was actually there at the time that we're studying. So if we want to study Malcolm X, his autobiography is going to be a primary source. It was created while he was still alive. He wrote it himself. Now, what if you were learning about Malcolm X, but you were reading an encyclopedia article about him? Well, an encyclopedia is going to be a secondary source. That wasn't created while he was alive. That's people taking information about him and writing a book about him after he already died. An encyclopedia is going to be a secondary source. It was not around while he was alive. It was created afterwards. Now, these are the different types of sources that we can use to get information about the past. On your worksheet, you're going to have to sort sources of information about Native Americans into primary sources or secondary sources. Remember, primary sources are sources that were created by Native Americans or by people who actually met and interacted with Native Americans. Secondary sources were written after. They were written second by people who were studying Native Americans, not the Native Americans themselves. All right, we're going to talk more about this later, but first take some time to finish the independent practice on your worksheet and get some practice with primary and secondary sources.